Hello Steelers, and welcome to this video in which I'm going to show you how I painted and weathered this Warlord Models 28mm scale Tiger tank. This is part of their new Achtung Panzer game German starter set, but can be used in many other war games as well, of course. You can buy the Achtung Panzer starter sets through my affiliate link for Warlord Games, which is in the link below. I will also put a link for all the materials that I use in the video description as well, but before we start, let's talk Tiger. The Tiger tank is arguably the most iconic tank of the Second World War, and had a fearsome reputation during the conflict, despite only being in production from 1942 onwards. Such was its reputation during the war that Allied tank crews often misidentified other German tanks as Tigers, whether any were actually present or not. However, the Tiger story actually began in the mid-war years as a 30+ ton breakthrough tank with the ability to mount a 75mm infantry gun. This early design gave rise to the sprung suspension of the later tank, along with the interleaved road wheels. By 1940, the German armoured fighting vehicles that were currently in use were outclassed in armour and weapons by the French and British tanks that they came up against during the Battle of France. The invasion of Russia in the following year demonstrated the shortcomings of the German tanks even more when they were faced with the T-34, and a radical new design was needed to combat the Russian armour. A new order went out that required a vehicle capable of mounting the 8.8cm flak 36 anti-aircraft gun, which had been successfully used in an anti-tank gun in France and also in Russia. This invariably increased the weight of the tank and with it the size of the power plant. The requirement for it to reach service quickly also created shortcomings in the vehicle's performance. However, the new tank quickly gained a fearsome reputation, first being used in Tunisia in December of 1942, and then across all the areas that Germany was fighting in. The power of the 8.8cm gun allowed the Tiger to destroy T-34s at some 1.5 km away, whilst the 76.2mm gun of the T-34 had to be considerably closer to even attempt to knock a Tiger out. These factors forced the Allies to begin upgrading their existing armour in a power struggle to supersede the Tiger, including introducing the T-34-85 and also the Sherman Firefly, both of which had the hitting power to actually knock out a Tiger. By this point though, the Tiger 1 had already been upgraded to the Tiger 2, an even bigger version of the Tiger, and this was in 1944. Whilst the Tiger had a fearsome reputation on combat, it did have many shortcomings. It was a complicated and expensive vehicle to manufacture, meaning that there had to be specially designed trained engineers to deal with recovering and repairing knocked out Tigers in the field. Also, its huge tracks, whilst beneficial for crossing soft and muddy ground, had to be changed to transport the tank on rail trucks, as they were just too big for the railways. This meant that each tank had to have two sets of tracks, one for combat and one for transportation. It may well have been a famous and deadly enemy, but by the war's end the Allies were outproducing Germany and creating bigger and better weapons to take on the German super tanks. I began building the kit following the instructions included, and it was a nice and simple model to put together using polystyrene cement. There are a lot of small parts, so I took my time and I ensured that I dry fitted everything before gluing them in place. The tracks came in a number of pieces, but are very cleverly designed and the fit is very snug. This was the same with the turret. The parts went together with a minimum of fuss, and soon enough I'd completed the entire model. One thing I did before continuing was to paint the exhausts in black before gluing the covers over them. This was then to ensure that there wouldn't be any unpainted bits that I couldn't get to later. With the main kit finished, I bought some stowage from Debris of War off eBay, and I added this to the rear engine cover. Stowage is a good way of adding interest to your vehicle, and it breaks up the silhouette and will add some different colours as well. Once the glue was dry on the model, I began painting. For the base colour, I used Vallejo's Middlestone. I didn't use a primer, as a few coats of the base colour mean you don't really need one anyway. If you want to use a primer, go ahead, you do you. Middlestone is a reasonable representation of the German Dunkelgelb, or dark yellow, base colour that all German tanks were produced in after February of 1943. This is the classic three-tone camouflage scheme that the Germans used in the late war. I ensured that everything was covered, used a big brush, and as I mentioned did a couple more coats just to ensure that there was a smooth finish. The three-tone camouflage scheme was complemented by Rotbrun, red brown and Olivegrün, dark green. This was applied in the fields by the crews, so it didn't have to have a particular type of pattern or even consistency, as the paint was often thinned out to be sprayed, as well as being painted by hand. Sometimes only one colour was used and sometimes none at all, it all depended on the circumstances. However, I wanted to have all three in a typical late 1943 camo scheme. So I started with Vallejo's chocolate brown for the rock brun, and using a big and old brush stippled the paint in random lines across the vehicle's hull and turret. It doesn't matter if this is messy, as there were no masks to help the crews anyway. Next, after the brown had dried, I used Vallejo's reflective green to do a similar pattern for the olive grun paint. This time I tried to avoid the brown, except in places where the camo lines crossed one another, but I did exactly the same technique as before. Once the camo had dried, I turned my attention to the turret numbers and other markings. Again, even though there were doctrinal orders where these should be placed, looking at old photos shows a huge amount of variety in the field. I used the 131 water slide decals for this that I got in the box, and using a small brush to get them in place just where I needed them. I then added a layer of microsol over the top as the decals are on the Zimmerit anti-tank mine paste, and I wanted them to conform to the ridges. Microsol softens the decal and it does the job perfectly. I let everything dry once again, and I took a big soft brush and I gently dry brushed dark sand across the entire vehicle. This was emphasising the edges of the hull and the turret and even the ridges of the Zimmerit. I was just careful here and I built it up in light layers, as it's easier to add paint than to take it away. So the first stage of weathering was about to begin, and to emphasise shadows and bring all the colours together somewhat, I used MIG Brown for dark yellow filter. This is an enamel filter and it can get into all the nooks and crannies due to the good capillary action. It goes on easily with a big brush and then it soon dries. Once it was dry, I used a cotton bud soaked in white spirits to wipe away some of the filter where it had formed on the large parts of the model. This left the filter in the recesses and created that nice grimy and shadowy look. If you wanted to, you could stop your weathering here, but I was determined to add a few more stages. The first of these were to add chipping to the edges of the turret and the hull, and for this I ripped up a sponge and dipped it in Vallejo's German camo black brown. I then dabbed the sponge on a piece of cloth to remove some of the paint, and gently dabbed it along the sharp edges of the model and in areas around hatches where wear and tear would occur. The next stage was to add rust marks. These will form very quickly once a tank's paint has chipped, and just a few showers of rain are enough to start rust forming. For this I am using Flurry Wash Rust. This is a clay wash that dries with a really nice rusty look and texture. I simply paint the wash into areas where rust would form and I streak it down the sides of the hull and the turret. I then use Flurry Wash Grime to do a similar thing and add grimy areas around hatches and joints in the metal pieces of the vehicle. Here you can add as much or as little as you want, but I didn't go too mad. Then the final bit of weathering on the upper part of the tank was to add rain streaks. These were done using AK Interactive's weathering pencils, specifically the rain streak one. These are watercolour pencils which, when dipped in water and used to draw lines on the model, can then be streaked using a wet brush. If you find it's too much, just simply remove the material with a clean and wet brush. Whilst all the weathering parts were drying, I then turned my attention to the tracks. I used the biggest brush to paint the entire track in black. I was careful to try not to get too much black on the other parts other than the track, but I'm going to be adding mud down here later on anyway, and this is also why I didn't bother painting the rubber road wheels. I also painted the tow ropes in black. These are huge metal ropes that were used to pull tanks out of ditches or wet ground, and as these weren't painted they would go rusty pretty quickly in rain, so we're going to simulate that in the next few stages. But first, as the black dried, I painted the stowage. I painted this in various greens and browns as it would have been picked up along the life of the tank and it would be random in its nature. It also helps to break up the shape of the tank and it gives a bit of colour other than the camo scheme. I painted the tools during this stage, first using beige brown for the wooden parts. I found conflicting evidence. One says the tools were painted in the same colour as the tank and others say that they weren't painted at all. I've gone with the latter as paint could have worn off, they could have been replaced, and also it adds some more interest to the model overall. I also painted the tool heads in oily steel, and then when they were dry I washed the stowage and the tools in Agrax Earthshade. This is a great wash that is made by Citadel and it gets into all the nooks and crannies and adds to help shadow and also shading to the model. I then painted the tracks in a heavy dry brush of oily steel. This was using a big brush and ensuring that some of the black showed through. I also did the same for the towing ropes and the exhaust tops. Then, using the Flurry Wash Rust, I went back over all the metal parts, such as the tow ropes and the tracks. Here I used a big brush and just ensured that the part I was painting was fully covered in the wash. As before, this seems very bright as it goes on, but it will dry nice and dull. We are on the home stretch now, and I turn back to the stowage and lightly dry brush the base colours back onto the pieces, whilst building it up in lighter and lighter stages. I didn't film all of this, but I just gave each piece a couple of lighter passes and then I was done with it. Now, as before, you could call your model done here, but I decided to do one final thing, and that was to add weathering powders. These ones are from Revel, but there's loads on the market to choose from. I started with dark brown and applied it with a big brush around the tracks and the running gear. I also created a small tide marker powder across the bottom of the hull. I didn't want to add mud with this tank, I just wanted some of the dry dust of summer. This time I went over the same areas, but this time with Revel's dried mud powder. Using the same technique, I wanted a couple of colour tones, just adding some variation to the dust. I also very quickly added black powder just at the end of the barrel for the gunpowder as well. And then my final stage was to go outside and spray varnish the model, and it was done. I know I should have scraped off the mould line from the barrel, but I didn't notice it until the end, and by then I just couldn't be bothered. Sue me. Well, thanks for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please do check out the rest of the channel. Also, leave a like and a comment, and if you haven't done already, please do subscribe. And I'll see you in the next Storm of Steel video.